We're now going to move into our discussion of the imperial periods, the periods of the empires. And what creates the idea of empire, right, starting here, of course, with the early empire, is, of course, having an emperor. So why is it an imperial period, right? Why is it early empire, right? Because we're now going to have emperors. So throughout the rest of our discussion of Roman art, a lot of what is created, the monuments that are produced, are related to the emperor and either trying to commemorate something they've accomplished, or in a sense trying to frame, the messaging that they want people to understand about the rulership and their reign. A lot of it's very much propaganda. It will be used as such. It's very political stuff. And we're starting here with the first emperor, which is Augustus. Now, Augustus was originally named Octavian, or sometimes people say Octavius. Doesn't really matter. And Augustus takes power after the death of his great uncle, Julius Caesar. So Augustus is part of what we call the Julio-Claudian line. Basically the patrician families that made up the Julio-Claudians, as they were called. And Julius Caesar was, of course, one of the famous figures within the Julio-Claudian line. If you don't know much about Julius Caesar, he had been a member of the Senate, and during a time of crisis, often the Senate would allow the election of a dictator, as they put it. And the dictator was supposed to make quick decisions in a time of crisis. Because if you've ever tried to make decisions by committee, well, it's a pain, right? So sometimes you need to have quick decisions, quick thinking, being nimble on your feet, right? So a dictator was what the Senate often would elect for these times of crisis. Now, after the crisis passed, the dictator was supposed to basically go back to being a typical senator. But if you know Caesar's story, he basically didn't do that, right? He basically was like, nope, I like being in power, And if you know the end of Caesar's story, then you know how it ends for him, where he's assassinated. So basically, his life is brought to an end, right, through the assassination that many of his other senators felt, he was owed, right, for his betrayal. And so that's the end of Caesar. Well, Augustus, or Octavian, as he was originally known, was the great nephew of Julius Caesar, but he also was his adopted son. So Julius Caesar, upon his death, actually left everything to Octavian. And this kind of credibility, as I mentioned within the patrician system, can't be underestimated. So people looked at, Octavius as somebody who had a lot of street cred, someone who had the patrician lines behind him. And you would think that people that basically had thrown off the idea of a dictator would balk at the idea of a sole ruler. And maybe they would have if it hadn't been somebody like Augustus. Now, Augustus, why does he change his name? August, right, to be Auguste in Latin is to be great. So he was basically saying, I am great. So think about the marketing here, right? And I always joke that his marketing was pretty accurate. If you think about the marketing of himself, I often talk about like politicians could learn a lot from Augustus if they don't know a lot about political history, because he was one of the first leaders in my mind to think a lot about framing propaganda messaging. And right out of the gate, he changes his name to be great. He's like, I'm great. There's a little bit of a hearkening back to Mesopotamia, kind of the Sargon thing here, but Augustus takes it so much further than that. So the name change, it's reflecting something about him, that he's going to be great. And as he struggles to gain power, because we know this time period, there was a lot of things in flux. He was battling, right, his enemies at this time. And he comes out triumphant. Once he becomes triumphant, he basically has to sell himself. And so I would say that maybe they wouldn't have wanted an emperor, but I think it all came down to how Augustus sold himself. And basically, he sold them the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. He said to the people of Rome, if you let me rule you, I will give you what you need to have peace and prosperity. You'll have all the things that you need. And it's one thing to try to sell something. It's another thing to actually be successful. And Augustus actually sold this and actually realized it. Because Rome will have 200 years of the Pax Romana from the time of Augustus through the High Empire. So he wasn't just a politician lying to you, right? He actually made good on his promise. And you might say, well, Romans were always at war. What he was talking about is there will be peace on the Italian peninsula, like the Mediterranean Italian Romans that we are. We will be peaceful, but we will obviously keep taking other, subsuming or absorbing other cultures. That's different, right? He meant for the Mediterranean Italians living on the peninsula that they would be safe, they would be fed, they would be taken care of. He also thought about how do you market yourself? And he came up with these 3 titles. The Princeps that you see here, the Pontifex Maximus, and the Imperator. So I'll talk about them each in turn. Princeps means first citizen. So he was saying, I'm the first citizen of Rome. This is great stuff. I would say when politicians try to say I'm one of you, it's fascinating. Because usually they're not one of you. They usually come from money. They usually, either fundraise it or they come from a family line with cash. Really in the world of politics today, you can't run for office unless you have money. You got to get it somehow, right? But you got to have it. And usually the best thing to do is be born into it. Easy peasy, you're done. So if you really think about most politicians, they're not from the commoners, right? But he says, I am the princeps, I am the first citizen. And he sells himself as a man of the people. Now, he's a patrician. He's from the Julio-Claudian line. We obviously know this is not true, but he finds a way to be accessible to his people. And so that's why I think that him being emperor was allowable to them, because he was very specific in how he wanted to rule them. He gave them peace. He wanted to be amongst them. Even if it's all just positioning and marketing, if you sell it right, it still works, right? So he said, I'm the first citizen, I am amongst you. But then he goes further. He realizes, just like Sargon did, that if you want to control something, you got to control everything. You can't just control one thing. You have to control everything around you. And he realized that he needs to control the religious institutions as well as the military. So his second title is the Pontifex Maximus. And you'll remember I told you when someone's wearing their toga this way, that it was indicative of them being a religious figure. So here you see Augustus wearing his toga over the head in the togoate, as we call it, and it lets us know that he is a religious figure. So as the Pontifex Maximus, he was like, I am the head priest. I lead the religious institution of Rome. Now, I've mentioned in passing that, to me, the religion of Rome is very much about control, but I haven't dove really far into that. I'd mentioned that the Romans took on the Greek gods and goddesses. They basically plagiarized them, cut and pasted them into their culture, just renamed them. And because of this, whenever I look at Roman religion, I don't see a deep sense of piety because they're just sampling somebody else's stuff. And when I look at Roman religion, it seems like it was meant to be something to kind of put as a veneer or an overlay over the culture to actually control the plebeians. To say to them, well, you don't want the gods to be angry, you got to make sure you worship the gods, right? Well, meanwhile, the patricians kind of understood the system of control that it created. So him being the Pontifex Maximus, to me, it really reflects this idea that if you have gods, you can distract the people. You can say, well, the gods are angry, or you need to appease the gods. We know that the Roman priests often would do ceremonies where they basically fudge the results. Like they would know that a certain symbol was read as, prosperity or something. They'd be like, 5 doves, flying through the sky are prosperity. And guess what they would let the people see? They would take the doves out of their cage and be like, fly little doves, right? And, it's prosperity, or, you get my point. They would do animal sacrifices and read the entrails and, basically say, yeah, we're seeing this. Yeah, that's what we're seeing. And we know this because the priests wrote it down. The priests left records in Latin about we would do things to convince the commoners that, the gods decreed this. So it's hard not to look at that religious system as, again, a veneer over which they were controlling the general population with this idea of a religious system. So to me, Augustus understood that part. I think he also understood that if he didn't want the priests rising against him, you better be in charge of them. Just like, Sargon's daughter, he understood if you let a certain class of your society have too much power and you're not paying attention to them, they could rise against you and take your power away from you. Which leads us to the third group, which is the military. And I think that Augustus understood very, very much that because the Romans were conquerors, they were going to go out and build empire. The final component he had to control, of course, was the military establishment. He had to have, control over them as well. So here he is as the Imperator. And if you know your statues that I've already shown you, you might be saying, he looks rather familiar. We'll get to that in a minute. But here he is dressed in battle armor, representing his connection to the military forces that he also has to control. One of the things I want to mention looking at Augustus's statues, I hope you've noticed that he's given up verism. I had mentioned that that was something you really only see very briefly during the Republican time period of Rome. So notice he's baby-faced and young. I mean, he was very young when he became emperor, but, obviously verism is not something they're really undertaking anymore and using. And you might also notice at the bottom of the statue, this little baby kind of pulling on his toga. That is representative of Cupid. And you might say, why Cupid? The Julio-Claudians actually said that they were descended from the gods Venus and Mars, or Aphrodite and Ares in the Greek tradition, love and war, the perfect dualities. And Cupid, of course, is Venus's son. So when Cupid pulls on Augustus's toga, what it's meant to represent to us as the viewer is that he's descended from the gods, right? He's not only patrician, but he's also, God-derived in a sense, that his family line comes from the gods. But again, he's also princeps, so he's also the first citizen. Notice that Augustus knew how to perfectly balance, to me, in a sense, how to be elite and elevated, and then how to be simple and accessible. And you realize that you have to control all of those elements to make everybody around you feel comfortable and have yourself not be threatening in a sense. Have yourself just be accessible to those that you're ruling while still giving the proper sense of power and control as well. So he knew how to balance, I think, these things really, really well at the end of the day. So, all of these are really propaganda pieces speaking to the things that he wants to represent to you. As I mentioned, if you're really looking at, some of these sculptures and thinking about it, you might say, wait a minute, I've seen this sculpture before. You'd be correct. The contrapposto is a direct mimicking of Polycleitus' spear bearer from our discussion of classical Greek sculpture, or the orator, right, from our discussion of Etruscan bronzes. Of course, the orator was meant to represent a Roman senator, so that's an even nicer kind of connection, right, between the two. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about Augustus's wife, Livia, before we look at the Arapaces in the next video. Livia was an interesting woman, and she'll play into some of the imagery that you see on the Arapaces, so I want to make sure I mentioned her. What's special about her? Well, first off, one of the things we know is that she was already married and had 2 children when Augustus decided as emperor that she should be his empress. And so the Romans were not against divorce. I told you before that we think a lot of Roman patrician families, a lot of why they married was to seal those connections from family to family. So Livia was already married, had 2 children, and basically her husband divorced her so she could marry Augustus. We assume that this was a win-win on all levels for everybody involved. She went up a notch. The old husband could be like, yeah, now she's married to the emperor, right? So again, it's an interesting way to think of political marriages. And when we read about Livia, it seems that she was very connected to the idea of legislating the social. This idea of perhaps having tax relief for people with families and children, higher taxation for those who were childless, right? And we call that legislating the social because it's legislating your social decisions and either giving you an incentive or something that's a deterrent. So when we talk about the Arapaces here in a second, in the next video, I'll go back to thinking about Livia, right, and her legislation of the social.